Pope Leo XIV stopped at the foot of a private jet and asked why a bishop needed a bedroom in the sky while elderly parishioners were missing medical appointments on the ground. The question was quiet, but every man on the runway heard it. The $5 million aircraft stood beneath the hangar lights, white with a gold stripe, and the Diocese of St. Raphael's crest beside the door. Inside were 12 leather seats, a walnut bar, and a private sleeping compartment. The bishop's staff called it a tool of ministry. Bishop Richard Callahan had planned to leave in 17 minutes. His destination, according to the flight sheet, was a pastoral conference in Arizona. Yet the baggage crew was loading golf clubs, cases of French wine, and 2 garment bags from a luxury resort. Callahan stood beside the stairs in a dark coat, smiling as though the Pope's unexpected arrival were an honor arranged for his benefit. Then Pope Leo noticed an old woman behind the security barrier. She was small, silver-haired, and seated in a folding wheelchair with one brake held together by blue tape. In her lap rested a worn pilot's cap. Her fingers kept smoothing the faded wings above the brim. A guard had already asked her twice to leave. "I only wanted to see it take off," she said. "My husband helped people fly home." Her name was Eleanor Walsh. She was 79 years old, the widow of Captain Thomas Walsh, a military transport pilot who had spent his retirement flying sick parishioners to distant hospitals in borrowed planes. Callahan glanced at her, then at the Pope. "Holy Father, Mrs. Walsh has misunderstood the nature of today's departure." Pope Leo looked at the wheelchair, then at the jet. What did she misunderstand? The bishop's smile tightened. Eleanor raised the cap slightly, as if asking permission to speak. 3 years ago, we gave them the money to begin Wings of Mercy, she said. They said this plane would carry people who had no other way. The bishop stepped forward at once. The program was restructured. These matters are complicated. The engines began to whine. 17 minutes had become 14. Pope Leo walked past Callahan and placed one hand on the jet's stair rail. He looked through the open door at the cream-colored seats and silver service trays. Then he turned to the old woman. "How many patients has this plane carried?" Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I was told not to ask any more." No one moved. The bishop's assistant checked his watch. The guard released Eleanor's chair. Pope Leo removed his hand from the rail. "This aircraft will not leave today. Effective now, it is under independent custody." Callahan stared at him. "Holy Father, turn off the engines." The whine died slowly, leaving the runway in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the tiny metal wings on her husband's cap tap against her wedding ring. But the stop flight was only the beginning. Because when the Pope asked to see the passenger records, Bishop Callahan did not refuse. He asked for 10 minutes alone first. Richard Callahan had led the Diocese of St. Raphael for 11 years. He was known for clean budgets, successful fundraising dinners, and the calm voice of a man who never appeared surprised. He remembered donors' names, arrived early, and answered difficult questions with sentences polished smooth enough to leave no place for blame. His favorite phrase was simple: Prudence protects the mission. He used it when rural food programs were reduced. He used it when 3 parish vans were sold. He used it when the small medical transport office founded by Captain Walsh was closed after Thomas died. Now he used it while standing inside the hangar conference room, with the darkened jet visible through the glass. The plane was purchased legally through the Diocesan Charitable Foundation, Callahan said. It allows leadership to travel efficiently, cultivate major gifts, and respond to emergencies. Pope Leo sat across from him. What emergency required golf clubs? Callahan did not look toward the baggage cart. Relationships with benefactors require discretion. The first records appeared clean. The Wings of Mercy campaign had raised nearly $7 million. $5 million bought the aircraft. The rest covered pilots, insurance, hangar fees, and maintenance. What the summary did not show was a single medical flight. Callahan explained that transporting patients created liability. Rural residents, he said, were better served by existing public systems. The plane's role had therefore evolved from direct mercy to strategic ministry development. Pope Leo repeated the words. Strategic ministry development. The bishop nodded. Without wealthy supporters, no charitable work survives. Then the Pope saw the number pair that changed the room. In the previous year, the jet had cost $840,000 to operate. In that same year, the diocese had denied 47 transportation requests, totaling less than $60,000. The oldest request had come from an 86-year-old widower needing weekly dialysis. The youngest from a grandmother raising 2 disabled adult sons. Each denial carried the same typed sentence. Transportation assistance is not currently consistent with strategic priorities. Pope Leo placed the page beside the pilot's cap Eleanor had left with him. Who chose these priorities? Callahan folded his hands. The Foundation Board accepted my recommendation. Who appointed the board? I did. And who approved your travel? The board. The bishop's eyes moved for the first time. Callahan's explanation was not foolish. It was efficient. He had built a circle in which every person approved the next, and every decision sounded responsible. He insisted no funds had been stolen. That was true. The money had simply been moved farther and farther from the people whose photographs had raised it. At fundraising dinners, screens showed veterans, widows, and families living hours from hospitals. Callahan stood beneath those faces and promised no one would be too distant to receive the church's care. The aircraft had flown 116 times. 38 flights ended near resorts. 22 carried major donors. 9 carried members of Callahan's extended family. The rest were listed as administrative or pastoral. Not one carried Eleanor Walsh. Not one carried a patient. Still, the bishop remained composed. Holy Father, sentiment cannot govern aviation. Pope Leo looked through the glass at the aircraft. No. But truth should govern charity. Callahan leaned back. He believed the matter was controlled because the documents showed no theft, only discretion. He believed the Pope would order a review, issue a warning, perhaps require the sale of the jet months later. Then Pope Leo asked for the maintenance key log. The bishop's assistant hesitated. It was only a small pause. But the Pope saw it. The log showed that one compartment at the rear of the cabin had been opened after nearly every donor flight, then sealed before staff cleaning crews entered. It was not listed on the aircraft plan. Callahan called it storage. His assistant called it confidential. The Pope looked at the clock. The flight had been delayed 41 minutes. Open it. For the first time that morning, Bishop Callahan lost the careful rhythm of his breathing. The hidden compartment was behind the walnut wall of the private sleeping cabin. A mechanic removed 2 screws. The panel opened 6 inches, then caught against something packed tightly inside. It was not money. It was paper. Hundreds of envelopes slid onto the carpet. Some were sealed, others bundled with rubber bands. Across them were handwritten words: dialysis, heart surgery, final visit, veteran, urgent. The bishop's assistant sat down without being asked. Eleanor's name appeared on 3 envelopes. Pope Leo lifted one, but he did not open it. Instead, he asked that Eleanor be brought inside. She entered the cabin slowly, refusing help until the chair caught on the narrow doorway. She apologized to the mechanic for taking too long. The Pope moved one of the cream leather seats aside himself. On the floor lay the request sent to Wings of Mercy during 3 years of silence. A former flight coordinator named Maria Torres was called to the hangar. She had worked for Captain Walsh and stayed 6 months after his death. When she saw the envelopes, she pressed both hands against her mouth. Maria said the original program had been ready. Volunteer pilots were approved, 2 hospitals had agreed to receive patients, and Captain Walsh had designed a blue crew patch, wings beneath a small cross. After Thomas died, Callahan cancelled the first scheduled flight. The patient was a retired school custodian named Harold Price. He needed to reach a cardiac center before noon. Maria had arranged the crew and filed the plan. Callahan's office stopped it because the aircraft was being shown that morning to 3 major donors. Harold traveled by car instead. The trip took 9 hours. He survived, but he never applied again. Then came the others. A widow trying to reach her sister before surgery. A veteran unable to fly commercially with oxygen. An old priest hoping to see his brother once more. Their requests had not been lost. They had been hidden. Callahan stood at the cabin door. These stories were emotionally compelling but operationally unsafe. Eleanor turned the pilot's cap in her hands. "My husband flew wounded boys through storms," she said. He knew what unsafe meant. The bishop looked at her, and something in his expression changed. Pope Leo noticed. He asked Maria why the envelopes had been placed in the aircraft rather than destroyed. She looked toward Callahan's assistant. The young man began to cry without making a sound. He admitted that Callahan had ordered every request removed from the diocesan office before donor visits. The bishop did not want wealthy guests seeing unresolved cases while touring the plane. The assistant had hidden them in the cabin, intending to preserve them until someone listened. But there was more. At the bottom of the compartment lay a small cloth pouch. Inside was the original Wings of Mercy patch, stained at one edge, and a photograph of Captain Walsh standing beside a much younger Richard Callahan. In the photograph, Callahan was not yet a bishop. He was a parish priest with one arm in a sling. 27 years earlier, a highway accident had left him trapped far from a trauma center. Thomas Walsh had flown him through severe weather to a hospital in Denver. The man whose mercy had saved Richard Callahan's life was the same man whose program Callahan later erased. The bishop sat on the edge of the bed. For several seconds, he was no longer the polished authority from the conference room. He was simply an aging man looking at proof of what he had once received and what he had refused to return. After the accident, Callahan had become afraid of unmanaged risk. When lawyers later warned that one medical flight could create disaster, he chose control. Donors offered predictable schedules and security. Patients offered uncertainty and possible failure. So he told himself he was protecting the mission. Pope Leo did not excuse him. "Fear may explain a closed hand," he said. "It does not open it." Eleanor looked at Callahan. "Richard, Thomas never asked whether helping you would improve his reputation." It was the first time anyone had used the bishop's first name that day. If this story brings to mind someone whose quiet service was forgotten, write their name in the comments and let them be remembered. The Pope gathered the envelopes into 3 stacks: urgent, delayed, and unanswered. Then he asked how quickly the aircraft could be converted for medical transport. The mechanics at a temporary configuration could be ready by morning, but permanent changes would take weeks. Pope Leo looked at the clock in the cockpit. A request in the urgent stack had been received that very morning. An 81-year-old woman named Ruth Bennett needed to reach a cardiac hospital before 6 o'clock that evening. Her rural ambulance service could take her only to the county line. A storm had grounded the medical helicopter. The jet could reach her in 50 minutes. But only if it left within the hour. Pope Leo turned to Callahan. "Bring me the fuel plan." The bishop remained seated. The Pope's voice did not rise. "No one leaves this hangar until this plane remembers why it was bought." By noon, the luxury cabin had begun to disappear. The wine cases were removed first. Then the golf clubs. The silver trays were packed away. 2 leather seats were unbolted to make space for a stretcher. The private bedroom door was taken off its hinges. Oxygen brackets from an unused diocesan van were fitted beside the wall. Callahan watched from the runway. Donors had already begun arriving for the postponed departure. They expected apologies and a rescheduled flight. Instead, Pope Leo asked them to enter the hangar. Eleanor sat in the front, still holding Thomas's cap. Maria stood beside the stacks of envelopes. Mechanics, pilots, nurses, parish workers, and members of the foundation board gathered behind them. The bishop approached the Pope. "This should be handled privately." Pope Leo looked at the faces that had been used in campaign photographs. The asking was public. The promise was public. The repair will be public. Callahan repeated his defense. Prudence protects the mission. The Pope pointed to Ruth Bennett's request on the table. From whom? No one answered. Does prudence protect her from missing the hospital? Callahan's mouth opened, then closed. Does it protect Mrs. Walsh from learning that her husband's name raised money for vacations? The bishop looked toward Eleanor. She was not angry. That made it harder. I did not want him punished, she said. I wanted the plane to do what Thomas believed it would do. Pope Leo picked up the Blue Wings of Mercy patch. He asked Callahan to come forward. For one terrible second, the bishop appeared ready to refuse. Then he walked across the hangar and stopped before Eleanor. The Pope placed the patch in his hand. You will remove your crest from the aircraft. Callahan looked at the painted diocesan shield near the door. You will attach this in its place. The bishop climbed a maintenance ladder himself. With a mechanic beside him, he covered the crest panel and fixed the old blue patch beneath the entrance. The moment was carried to parish halls across the diocese. Elderly donors who had once mailed $5 and $10 reached for handkerchiefs as Thomas Walsh's forgotten wings replaced the bishop's crest. When he came down, Pope Leo gave him the passenger manifest. There was only one name on it. Ruth Bennett. You will not travel as bishop today, the Pope said. You will travel as the man responsible for bringing her safely aboard. Callahan's face changed. That was the punishment no courtroom could have designed. He would not be hidden in an office. He would stand before the person his policy had nearly abandoned. The aircraft departed 36 minutes later. Thousands gathered as parish phones began ringing. Older men arrived in work trucks. Prayer groups brought folding chairs. Nurses stood outside the county hospital. Families who once received denial letters watched the flight path on their phones. When the jet landed near Ruth's town, Callahan stepped onto the wet runway without an umbrella. Ruth Bennett arrived in an ambulance, wearing a hospital bracelet and a pale blue sweater. She was frightened by the stairs. Callahan knelt beside the stretcher and told her they would lift her slowly. She recognized him. My letter came to your office, she whispered. Yes, he said. Did you read it? He could not protect himself with procedure anymore. No. Ruth closed her eyes. Then she said, You are reading it now. The bishop bowed his head. The aircraft reached the cardiac hospital with 43 minutes remaining before the surgical team's deadline. Ruth was taken inside. Her daughter, who had been driving from another state, arrived just before the doors closed. Back at St. Raphael, Pope Leo did not wait for the result before acting. He dissolved the foundation board and placed the fund under independent oversight. The jet was transferred permanently to a new medical charity governed by doctors, volunteer pilots, rural clergy, and 2 representatives chosen from the families who had submitted requests. The private bedroom would become a medical station. The walnut bar would be removed. The operating budget would be published beside the number of patients served. The resorts disappeared from the flight calendar. In their place came hospitals, disaster zones, rural airfields, and family reunifications approved for the terminally ill. Then the Pope announced the most visible restitution. Every person whose story had raised money would be named inside the cabin, not beneath a bishop's crest, but as someone the plane existed to serve. Callahan returned after Ruth entered surgery. He walked into the hangar alone. Eleanor was still there. He handed her Thomas's pilot cap, which he had carried on the empty return seat. "I made your husband into a symbol," he said. I forgot he was an example. Eleanor examined the cap to make sure the wings were still pinned straight. Then she gave it back. "Keep it until the next patient comes home." Callahan took the cap with both hands. For the first time, he understood that confiscation was not the end of his punishment. Service was. 6 weeks later, the aircraft returned from its 23rd medical flight. Its gold stripe was gone. The private crest was gone. Above the door sat the small blue patch Captain Thomas Walsh had designed years before. Ruth Bennett walked from the plane with a cane and her daughter beside her. Eleanor waited near the hangar in the same wheelchair, but the broken brake had been replaced. Bishop Callahan stood at the foot of the stairs wearing no ceremonial coat. He carried blankets, checked oxygen tanks, and learned every passenger's name before takeoff. Pope Leo watched from a few steps away as Eleanor placed Thomas's cap on Callahan's head for one photograph. Then she removed it and rested it in her lap. Inside the cabin, where the walnut bar had once stood, a plain brass plate carried a single sentence. What was lifted by pride would now be carried by mercy. The engines started. This time, no one asked where the plane was going. They asked who it was bringing home.